Welcome to the podcast series dedicated to living a revenue culture. For a business to succeed or even survive in the short term, they have to maximize profit. The interesting thing is the only way you maximize profit is first to optimize a people-first culture. This podcast is dedicated to bringing you people who are out there in the real world today working on how to do that. And today I am thrilled to have Dan Kasper with me. Dan's a passionate, adaptive growth architect. He's a lifetime learner and adventurer committed to pushing the human race forward. For 6 years, Dan was part of the Navy SEAL Special Ops Organization. He's been a CEO, he's been a board member, and today he's the General Manager of Instill. And Instill has created a culture operating system, and I'm fascinated to hear more about that today. And that operating system is designed to help organizations design their culture, measure it, manage it, and then scale high-performing cultures. So, Dan, welcome. I'm thrilled to have you here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Rick. I've been very much looking forward to this conversation as well, and the thrilled feeling is actually mutual.
Well, good. And I have to just ask you to start with a little bit about your background and how you got to Instill. And then we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about it because you're the first person I've had whose their whole business model is around the part most of us think is fluffy or difficult or hard to do. And you guys have got an operating system that I'm guessing is going to help us do that.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's been kind of an interesting trajectory of culture and how that's been interwoven in companies. But our goal is to really turn culture into something that has been historically fluffy, as you mentioned, hard to understand, somewhat of like reading tea leaves to try to figure out how do we improve this thing, and really turn it into something that is highly targeted, injecting a lot more science and technology that has ever really existed in people tools before.
Well, cool. So give us your background, how you got here, because you've already done some cool stuff before Instill.
Yeah, absolutely. So my passion, Rick, is really building high-performing teams. I was molded professionally, as you mentioned, in a place where teams were literally life and death. As an explosive specialist with the SEAL teams for about 6 years, the interesting piece about the special operations environment is you don't have a $1 billion boat, you don't have a $100 million plane. What you do have is people. And you have people, and the culture of the teams that you build is absolutely critical and essential to success. And so that is a theme that really I carry forward even to today. I still very much believe that teams are life and death, maybe not as literal as the environment that I was initially in, but I promise you, you could have the best business idea in the world and it will fall short unless you truly empower your people to create a culture that drives performance. So that was really my molding point, was in the Navy. Had a chance to get out and join the tech environment, worked at Airbnb on the trust and safety team, built out some teams in North America and Asia Pacific. Love the tech environment, but I figured out I like to build, to scale, to grow, and so made a jump to running smaller stage companies. So ran a HR tech company for about 5.5 years as CEO. We built rewards and recognition software. And then made a jump to the founding team of Instill, or as you mentioned, we're pioneering this new category, which we're calling a culture operating system.
You know, Dan, it's interesting when you talk about the SEALs, and obviously culture there is life and death. But in our work, you know, the Revenue Game, my company, one of the things we've learned is that the culture is life and death for a company if they don't get it right. And if they get it right, it's a wonderful life. So, you know, we see life and death occurring. You know, revenue science is about life and death for a company, where medical science is about life and death for people. But getting that culture right is critical for a business to survive.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Rick. It's something that is so foundational to the concept of driving lasting value for a business. And while it is something that has, historically been difficult to measure, to understand, it's something now with some more cutting edge technology that's available in other elements of our businesses that we can inject into some of the people tools and really make it something that can be very targeted, very actionable, and something that we can be very intentional about. Instead of letting culture happen to us, we can craft our own destinies and making sure we're creating a culture that is going to help us achieve our business vision and our strategies.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear you say that, because I get to see literally hundreds of CEOs every year, some years thousands, and they'll say, well, when we make more money, then we're going to focus on culture. And I find that fascinating because, to your point, they already have a culture. It may not be one they want long term, but they've already got it. And, and they're not going to make a lot of money until they get it right. So tell us how Instill works, and what people should be thinking about when, if I read what you're saying correctly, you're giving them a choice that they can design their own culture and have the one they want and need, or they can keep doing what they're doing. Is that close?
Yeah, you're exactly right. So a little bit more context and color on our specific tool. As we mentioned, our goal is to really inject a lot more science and technology than has existed before. So we first started with a lot of science and research. So we have 7 PhDs on our roster, backgrounds in neuroscience, organizational psychology, predictive analytics. And then even before we wrote a line of code for our platform, which we've crafted, we wanted to look at the evolution of culture. As we know, the last few years have been a wild ride, to say the least. At least it's been ups and downs and left and rights, both socioeconomically, microeconomic wise. Like, it's just been a wild environment. And so we wanted to understand that evolution to making sure we are crafting a product that's going to be useful for the cultures that we're seeing now and in the future, and not what has been. And so we work with the Stanford Berkeley Computational Culture Lab, Caltech, and the U.S. Army Research Lab to facilitate that study, and the findings from that serve as the foundation for our culture operating system. Now, when I mentioned culture operating system, a lot of people are like, what the heck is that? Well, almost envision something like a HubSpot or a Salesforce, but for your culture. And the software really has 3 main pillars. And the first pillar surrounds exactly what we were just talking about. It's around codifying your culture. So how do we take culture from something that has historically lived on a poster in your wall in your office somewhere into something that's digital, that's extremely intentional, and also something that you can interact with, something that helps us get to where we want to go as an organization, as a team. The second pillar surrounds measuring your culture. So we crafted a series of culture vital signs. Think of these as culture KPIs. They are applicable in any and all teams. We worked on this with our organizational psychologists and our neuroscientists. We measure things like psychological safety, trust, resilience, innovation, inclusion, overall performance. We can slice and dice that a bunch of different ways to making sure all of our communities are represented. And then we have AI models that actually suggest how to activate this. And that was another problem statement. A lot of organizations, as we know, if you go to LinkedIn and Google, we talk a lot about culture, but the difficulty is, how do we activate that? How do we take it from rhetoric and go beyond that? So that was another element to the story, Rick. And then the last piece of the software, the last pillar, surrounds how do we build smarter teams? So we give recommendations from the hiring process all the way to crafting teams for a specific purpose. So instead of just throwing darts at a wall, and that's how we've historically formed teams in the work environment, we can be more intentional to really optimize a team for its intended purpose.
Wow. And I've got lots of questions, but the first one I want to ask is, in our review of what goes on in culture, we see purpose as a big element in organizations, and even to the extent that if I see a company that I believe in their purpose, I either want to do business with them or go to work for them or partner with them in some way, shape, or form. In the work you guys do, how does purpose show up?
It's essential. And as you mentioned, Rick, it is really the North Star, and it should be. And so really our purpose and our vision is to truly democratize the power of world-class cultures and allow culture to be a competitive advantage for organizations. Essentially, we want to help organizations better achieve their vision. So how can we leverage our culture to better empower other organizations to accomplish that? So that's our purpose and impact. And it is critical for organizations to look internally first, like, why do we exist? Why are we here? What is the impact and problems we're solving? And as you alluded to beginning, organizations that have that powerful why statement, that solve problems or bring value, those are the companies that we're seeing drive lasting value and lasting success. Conversely, if we flip the coin and say, hey, I want to start a business to make money, and we just kind of maneuver about, chase that silver dollar back and forth, we see from our research that the valuation and also profitability of those companies are actually substantially lower than those that are truly out to solve a purpose and have an impact.
Yeah, I'm smiling because, and the pandemic shone light on a lot of things that were in the dark before, but one of them that became really clear was organizations, we call it a purpose scale, and on one end of the scale is what we call big purpose. And whatever that big purpose is, it somehow makes the world a better place. I mean, it doesn't have to be environmental. It can be you're making a better low-cost home for people to live in, but you're doing something that makes the world a better place. And that typically has elements of thought leadership. It's typically, as Simon Sinek would say, infinite instead of finite. And, so there's that one end of the scale. The other end of the scale is, we use the term mercenary. And it's really about fulfillment, and it's short term. And there's nothing wrong with it. When the hurricane went through Florida, you'd take anybody who could put a roof on your house, and you weren't looking for a long-term relationship. But, if you're not in a fulfillment economy, you'd really rather partner with that thought leader who has a big purpose and, so on and so forth. What we thought we saw, and I haven't seen research on it, so I don't know for sure, but the worst place to be is neither of those two. Where one day, well, yeah, we like big purpose, but we really want the money. And to me, that's a hard place to work. It's a hard place to invest in. It's a hard place to partner with. And it's not really a company I want to do a lot of business with, because I don't know which one's going to show up today. Does that fit what you guys do?
Absolutely. And plus one to everything you're saying, especially, the concept of the infinite game theory with Simon Sinek and that mindset. I would agree. If we're looking at two of those different camps, I think the worst place to be is not picking a camp, or not kind of bouncing between the two and not being consistent. And that's one of the elements that we look to help triangulate organizations' culture, meaning, hey, if we look at kind of an X, Y, and Z axis, like, what's the culture that you have? What's the culture that you would like? But third, what's the culture that's right for you? And I think it's so important to really define that and have an end state we can work towards. If we kind of relate that to a sales environment, like, when does it happen that we just kind of stumble across revenue and that's what we have? We just let revenue happen to us. That doesn't happen. So why are we accepting that for arguably the most important element of our company, which is our team? We need to be strategic about this. We need to have an end game. We need to understand what is right for us and what will the culture be to help us achieve our business goals. So I very much agree to that mindset, and also the dangers of not picking or kind of bouncing around between the two.
Yeah. You also raise another really interesting question. When we think of a revenue culture, the humans in the revenue culture in our model, of course, whoever's the shareholders, they're clearly in it. The senior leadership is clearly in it. The employees are clearly in it. And all of them today and future. So it's not just today's employees, but it's future employees. And the same thing, we believe we use the term ideal buyer. And you used a value term earlier that I want to talk more about in a few minutes, but our purpose normally dictates our value that we're going to transfer. And so the ideal buyer really gets our value and is glad to pay us for what it's worth. But there are buyers out there who don't get our value, and they aren't really a contributing member of our culture. And so we think the buyers are part of our culture, as well as our business partners and the community. Do all of those players fit in your model?
Yeah, I love that thought, Rick. And I think all too frequently we look at culture as something that is internal to us, which is, I think, only a little bit short-sighted to the overall environment. Because if we do culture right, that is going to have an impact and create an environment where people want to work for us, that people want to work with us. And so helping to create an environment and a community around your culture, who you want to work with, having it defined, what we bring to the table and how can we help others achieve that, I think is absolutely critical. And leveraging our clients, partners, communities to help create our culture and amplify it. It's almost like that one-to-many approach. Even again, relating that to overall business performance, when you're making a strategic plan, you're not just looking at inside, like, what do we want to do? You're looking at the environment, you're looking at the economic picture, you're looking at your competitors, you're looking at what do you want to do more or less than them. Again, we need to relate culture to the, strategicness, if that's a word,
Yeah.
to the overall business. Like, we need to be just as intentional. And so looking externally and making sure that they're a part of who we are and how we tell our story helps to intertwine and ingrain and build a community around the product and the problems that you're solving.
Yeah, I love that. And you're tickling all kinds of really interesting thoughts. One of the things we historically help people measure is what we call the cost of the chaos to produce revenue.
Mm-hmm.
And the cost of chaos is typically the result of one of two things. One is you have no alignment. And of course, no alignment's typical of bad culture. Everybody's doing their own thing, and it's not they're bad or anything. They just don't have a common direction or a common purpose, so they just do whatever they think is right at the moment. And then the other one is they fight the science. And as you were talking about people wanting to work with people that they trust and they believe in, science tells us that's real. And so if you don't have an environment where that's happening, you've chosen to fight the science. And the result is the chaos for a B2B company is 20 to 40% of top line. So it sounds like you guys you'd be just whacking the chaos right out of the place.
Well, I love the intentionality that you bring to the table, Rick. I can obviously tell that, the solutions you provide are top end. How you're articulating this, how you're measuring some of the chaos, and then how that combines back into the overall business metric is exactly right. Our goal is to really do a lot of the things that you're talking about, be intentional, leverage more technology, but also integrate the science. While we are a tech platform, we want to leverage technology not to replace the human experience at work, but to really augment who we are. And even like things like, creating values, like that's something that we're wired as humans to go about a certain way. If we look at anthropology, humans have building tribes and communities for millennia. And so how do we do that? How do we digitize that and making sure that we don't fight science, but really bring it into solutions for culture? Because it is challenging to look at humans. We're not just zeros and ones. There's so much complexity to who we are, but to be able to leverage, the behavioral sciences, predictive analytics, and layer that in with psychology and neuroscience. Now we're doing something that's kind of innate to who we are. We're just creating and codifying that process to help fuel revenue and help fuel profitability.
Yeah, this is really a great conversation, because one of my I guess one of my hot buttons is the word value, and you've used it at least 3 or 4 times already in 20 minutes. And I can work with clients for months, and unless I bring that word up, it doesn't happen. And now we've gotten to the point that I ask people this question. I ask them, how many times a day do you consciously think about helping to transfer monetizable value to your ideal buyer? And the last time I asked that question to 16 CEOs in a room, they all looked at me and they all said, not ever. I never think about transferring monetizable value to an ideal buyer. And if you don't transfer monetizable value to an ideal buyer, why would they give you money?
Yes.
And the only answer I can come up with is because you're the best of the worst. Everybody else is worse than you are, and so you're their only choice. But that value transfer piece in a culture, and maybe you guys have research on this, but my belief is that when I transfer value to a buyer who appreciates it, that fulfills me personally.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I love, the value conversation relating it to culture, because, historically, and this comes a lot of the problem statements, culture has been something that you just kind of let happen. It's not something you can be in control of. It doesn't tie to business valuation. And we strongly oppose that. So kind of tying to the, previous conversation we were just having too, like value is 100% wired in us as humans. I don't think it's not just in business, but also how we innately conduct our lives. We spend time and money on things that bring us value, that charge our batteries, that fill our cups. And so how can we bring that to the business environment and focus on creating value from a solving problem standpoint, from a creating a relationship and community standpoint, to even, in this environment, in this year, I've even seen some, more buying decisions come from, hey, what value can you help us solve? But also avoiding a loss, which is another interesting piece too. So can we tie into fear, which is another human emotion, and help them avoid a loss with a solution, which in today's environment, I've noticed be more impactful in sales-related conversations than even showing value.
Yes, yeah, I love this. One of the things we try and teach our clients to do is, we tell them never use the word demo, because demo is about the seller. And the buyer, when somebody says they want a demo, my body reacts in a get away from me. I don't want you to be pushing something down my throat. So we suggest they talk about previewing what the world would be like if they worked with you. And when you help people preview a different world, you get them to talk about, well, what are you afraid of? Or what are the risks that you don't know how to address today? Or, how much more motivated would you be if? And then when you can have that conversation, you can ask the ideal buyer, well, if these things were to occur in the future, what would that be worth to you? And it's interesting, their answers are multiple times bigger than the ROI I would have given them just on money stuff. Because they'll talk about decreased turnover, they'll talk about more engaged staff, they'll talk about customers who aren't mad at them. And, they'll place huge monetary values on that in a way as a cost accountant I couldn't do.
Yeah, that philosophy very much resonates with me. And I think on multiple levels, and you're exactly right. People that try to force things down are, the stereotypical salespeople, they struggle. But if we can truly align ourselves with our radical buyer, understand their pain points, how do they think? How can we help them genuinely solve their problems and make it about them and help it tell a story surrounding what would your life be like if, even in challenging environments where culture has been hard historically to quantify, like we're talking big numbers in terms of how much churn is costing, how much lack of productivity is costing you, how much do mishires cost you? What about time understanding, and implementing manual solutions? Like these are high dollar items. And if we can help them quantify that and bring them along by asking meaningful questions, they're going to solve that question themselves. What is the ROI? And the sales conversation, it's not really a sales conversation it is by proxy, but you're about solving problems, and it helps to build that relationship piece, which we're also creating and tying back into human, anthropology and connection.
Yep. And it's interesting. Mathematically, we know we're never going to have enough of the right kind of employee going forward because our working age population is getting smaller and smaller.
Yes.
So we really don't have a choice but to find other organizations that we can truly partner with, that they can meaningfully become part of our culture, because we can't fill all those gaps internally. They're just aren't, even if we had enough money, there aren't enough of the right people available. And so what you were just talking about becomes critical. I want to partner with somebody who can fill this gap and I can trust them, because then I don't have to try and hire somebody that I can't find and I can't train. I'd just as soon outsource all that, and not for the week. I'd like to outsource it for the rest of the decade.
100%. And that's, some of the concepts of building a platform surrounding culture is essentially kind of think of this as like a virtual chief people officer. We can be in the right places, help you strategize surrounding elements of your culture. And this is important too, whether you go through or you're looking for technology solutions or just in general, like we want to make sure that we can leverage today's tools that are applicable in any environments, and what other departments are already using, making sure we're applying that to our people teams as well.
So walk us through, if I, found you guys on the web and I sent you a note and said, let's talk, what would you be telling me? And if we decided to go forward, what would the engagement look like?
Yeah, so with working with Instill, it's very much a partnership. And so the beauties of the platform and the culture operating system is that triangulation piece. So each organization, we want to help them triangulate what is the culture that helps to build and accomplish their vision mission. On the onboarding piece, you mentioned a really key element to that. We actually run a gap analysis. So understanding what the leadership views as culture and what the general employee population feels is their culture, figure out where there's alignment and where there's disparities. And then we can really be targeted on, okay, what do we need to work at first? We get people onboarded within the platform. The platform, because of the technology we use, actually learns more about your culture, the more data it connects and captures. So it's a continuous learning tool, and it gives active recommendations to different people and based upon your role and permission. So we really believe in that activation piece. We believe that all people are keepers of the castle and keepers of the culture. And so we really have a targeted approach on helping you craft the teams, helping you start to measure elements of your team so you can really have that board level conversation. And most importantly, drive that change, whether it's bringing on the right people, building smarter teams, or those little concept of like marginal gains where if we, amazing cultures aren't built overnight. It's not a flick of a light switch and you have that. It's these little things we do over time. So those suggestions can be really helpful to making sure that we're working towards that end state of the culture that's right for us.
Tell me how do you collect the data? I mean, do you do interviews? Do you do questionnaires? Do you do surveys? Are you capturing operational outcome data? How do you collect data?
Yeah, great question, Rick. And there's actually two different ways we're approaching this. The first of which is more traditional methods, active ways to collect the data, such as assessments. Now, we leverage 4 different styles of assessments. What we saw predominantly on the market was pulse surveys. They're great. We use them too, but they're also subject to recency bias. So whatever happens most recent in your work experience can actually skew the data and weigh the most heavily. So we also built little micro assessments for each one of the culture vital signs. We leverage psychometrics, i.e. how people are wired, and then that gap analysis. So that's one of the elements. On the other side is something that we're also beta testing right now with a few of our early clients. And this is essentially continuous learning, meaning that we've developed with our science team and models surrounding natural language processing and sentiment analysis that can plug into communications channels such as Slack or Teams, general channels. And we look at the use of language. And without having to run assessments, because we know in today's world, survey fatigue is real, we can arguably get more accurate data based upon looking at the use of language, things like the use of we versus I, the amount of questions asked in relation to statements, the amount of population involved in conversation, and then we can populate the dashboard as well. So you can pick one or the other. You can do both at the same time. And right now we're going through some case studies to get, how do these different methodologies work at populating the data?
Wow, fascinating. And I couldn't help but laugh as you did the we versus I, because one of the things we've done for years is we'll look at clients' email, they'll do a big proposal, and then the cover email will have I or me or our company name in 3/4 of a page 60 times. And you're just going, how can you even get it in that many sentences? And who's it about? It's about the seller. It's not about solving the buyer's problems. And websites are the same way. And, it's crazy. The frame of reference that people use and somehow expect the buyer to like that.
Exactly. Our language means things. And when we work in an environment where most of our language is now done via text and type, we want to be aware of that. And it also speaks to who we are and the effectiveness of our teams. So if you've ever used Grammarly, for example, at the bottom, when you're typing, it has like a little heart or a fist. It speaks to the tone of the copy that you're writing. Similar concepts to what we're using that can also then break that down and then feed the dashboard. So it's really interesting technology. Naturally, we want to making sure that we're transparent about it, that we bring value, and the data privacy is obviously top of mind for us, but it's a really interesting way that can make sense to avoid a lot of survey fatigue and also capture more accurate information that can be more valuable and help you get to that ideal culture faster.
Now, one other thing that as I was listening, part of the work we do tells everybody you have two choices, just like we have the culture choices of mercenary or big purpose. You have a choice of, are you headquarters out or buyer back? And the way you were collecting data sounds like you'd be able to learn about the buyer in a very objective kind of way and see trends and changes in the market. Is that true?
So that's one of the ways we're testing, because there's so many different things you can do with sentiment analysis and natural language processing, and some of the more cutting edge, even new concepts from like OpenAI and ChatGPT. There's so many different things we can do with the use of language that are changing how we work. And so, yes, there are some elements that we are testing. Also, we can have a plug-in to, let's say, Google or Zoom meetings. We can use the language, and then it can start to build profiles from our radical buyer that says, this is the tone that best resonates for them. Maybe we can filter that by if I'm talking to executives, or maybe I'm talking to directors of people or managers, and then I can start to understand who they are, how they like to communicate. Then I can cater my approach to better resonate with them. So it's about creating empathy, but doing it very intentionally, leveraging some of these really interesting pieces around science. So that way I know who I'm talking to, I know what way to communicate with them, and it can facilitate a more effective conversation.
And I'm assuming that you could also compare this month's communication to 6 months ago to see if there were changes in trends?
You're exactly right. Another thing that we think is super important is to overlay what's happening in the organization to close the loop on what we're suggesting. So just again, collecting data for the sake of data is useless. Like, the goal of collecting data is to drive action. And then we also want to understand what happened. So let's say there was a massive round of layoffs, and then you would likely see the psychological safety scores drop. You may see the trust scores drop. Maybe the burnout of employees that are staying out is increasing. We'd be able to overlay those key business facets or what happens in business life to understand, here's the impact that a layoff had on your culture, and then what do we then do to rebound, or what do we do to take the culture to another place that may be an evolution of what we had seen historically.
Wow. I think I could talk to you for the next 2 or 3 hours without any trouble at all. But to try and keep this to our normal length of time, I've got two more questions for you. One, what do you see as the trend going forward? I mean, you guys obviously got in this business not to be where you were last year, but what do you see coming in the future that organizations and individuals should be thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me talk a little bit what I'm seeing this year, and then also what I think the future will hold for some culture concepts in 10 to 20 years. This year, it's a really interesting piece what we're seeing in 2023 with our research. So engagement slump is continuing. Even within the best practice organizations, we are seeing a decline in engagement, something to be aware about for us as leaders. And actually, the highest burnout that we're seeing is your frontline managers. So recommend spending some extra time with them, making sure that they're feeling comfortable and supported for all the different things that they're managing and facilitating. We're also seeing there is a significant leader-employee disconnect. You talked about the importance of alignment, and that alignment there is getting further apart. And so what executives look down and see, hey, my culture is unicorns and rainbows. We get down into the employee population, and that may not be the case. So something to consider is not just looking top down on culture, but making sure that you go bottom up and understanding and ensuring there is alignment in what you're seeing. And then something that you also mentioned too is the employee experience is truly feeling the customer experience. We used to hear the customer is always right. Our recommendation from our research is if you feel your employees, you create a culture where they can do their best work, they're going to create a brand that people want to work for and people want to work with. So how can we create an employee experience? Because this is more critical than we've ever seen in the depths of our data. To really create that employer brand that can help increase innovation, reduce burnout, and really help drive that revenue because people want to work with you. So that's what we're seeing significantly this year. If you want to kick that out, down the line 5-10 years or so, there's a guy by the name of Zig Ziglar. He has this quote where you don't build a business, you build people, and the people build a business. So that we've seen from our research really become more and more important. There's lots of data surrounding how culture ties to profit, value, business performance. We see that 80% of CEOs rank culture as top 5 factors driving company valuation. We see that companies listed as best practices to work have 30% higher returns over a 5-year period. So it's very important to make sure we're driving culture, and it's no longer a nice to have. So if we look at the demographics that are coming into the workforce that are currently in there, it's not optional anymore if you want to drive a business with lasting value and lasting profitability. You create an environment where people can do their best work. You're going to attract, retain, have the highest productivity, and everything that you would want to accomplish for your business, of course, with money, if you solve the problem, solve on value, that will come. And that's going to be even more important in the next 5-10 years.
Wow. I could do another hour just picking up on what you just said, but I'm not going to. I'm going to invite you back because there's so much stuff you're doing that people should be hearing about. My last question for you is, what advice do you have for new people in the first half a dozen years of their career, and for the senior people when it's about the culture that you either are creating or are gravitating to or away from? What advice do you have for both of those groups?
Yeah, I think for those who are starting a career, it's essentially threefold from my perspective. One of which, seek out companies with strong cultures. And now a culture that may be right for you may be not right for your friend. So making sure you understand who you are and what environments and cultures work best for you, identify that early on and target those companies, but have it be a key factor when you're looking for jobs. It's not going to work out for you if you have conflicting values with the company. It's not saying you're right or they're wrong or vice versa. We want to work environments where we can be who our authentic selves and bring a diverse perspective there. So seek out companies that match your culture. 2, I would say, be a culture champion. We see all too often that, of course, culture starts at the top, but every single person holds that key to the culture. So be an advocate for it. Be a team member. Have fun when you work. Be and live your values. And I think the last piece is also advocate for culture initiatives. If your company isn't doing something or think they could do more, don't wait for that to happen to you. Step up, do something. Create that culture that you want to see and be that change. So I'd say those 3 pieces for those starting careers. And then for leaders in current organizations, prioritize culture. As some of the statistics that we're seeing, improving company culture is absolutely pivotal to that infinite concept of creating business value. So make it important. It needs to be just as important as looking at revenue goals, gross margin goals, EBITDA goals. It's just as important. 2, my advice is to leverage technology. Now, we are humans, but how can we leverage some of the really cutting edge technology we have out there to augment our experience, to make it easier for us to better understand who we are at work and then make more actionable decisions off that? And speaking to that, actionable decisions and data, making sure that we're leveraging data in our people decisions is absolutely critical. Like, we can't be the only department in board meetings that says, "Hey, Dan, how's the team doing?" And we say, "Good," when sales and operations and finance just got done presenting and they're throwing in all sorts of numbers, forecasts. Like, we need to be just as data driven in our people concepts as every other department.
Amen. Oh, wow. Dan, this has been great, and I'm loving this conversation. I am going to invite you back in a few months because there's just so much that we could unpack. So, is there anything you'd like to leave us with?
From my perspective, really just a charge to be conscious of your culture. Now, every organization is different. I'm not saying Instill is the only way, but my ask is just really make your people a priority. You have the traditional hierarchy where the CEO and leadership sits on top. My advice is to flip that upside down. How can you be a facilitator and a leader to your people? How can you facilitate their success? In turn, I promise you, they're going to create a world-class business for you and make you look like a rock star. So prioritize your people. Creating cultures do drive business valuations. If you have any questions or want data surrounding what that looks like so you can be a champion internally, please hit me up. I'll provide you with all sorts of data that any executive would be hard to turn away from.
Terrific. And, I love your closing, because when I talk to CEOs, they're always talking about being innovative or customer intimate or operationally excellent or whatever. And I often wonder who they think does that. It's the culture, and the people in the culture know how to do it better than those of us at the top do. So you just gotta let them do it.
100%.
So, Dan, thank you. It's been great. And for those of you who joined us today, I appreciate it. And I hope you'll be back with us for the next one. And please reach out to Dan or reach out to me if either one of us can help you. We'd love to. Thanks for being here today.